Chapter 2 of The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 2. The Eavesdropper. It is one of the canons of correct conduct, scrupulously adhered to, when convenient, by all well-bred persons, that an acquaintance should be initiated by a proper introduction. To this salutary rule, which I have disregarded to the extent of an entire chapter, I now hasten to conform, and the more so, insomuch as nearly 2 years have passed since my first informal appearance. Permit me, then, to introduce Paul Berkeley, M.D., etc., recently, very recently qualified, faultlessly attired in the professional frock-coat and tall hat, and, at the moment of introduction, navigating with anxious care a perilous strait between a row of well-filled coal-sacks and a colossal tray piled high with kidney potatoes. The passage of this strait landed me on the terra firma of Fleur-de-Lis Court, where I halted for a moment to consult my visiting list. There was only one more patient for me to see this morning, and he lived at 49 Neville's Court, wherever that might be. I turned for information to the presiding deity of the coal shop. "Can you direct me, Mrs. Giblet, to Neville's Court?" She could, and she did, grasping me confidentially by the arm, the mark remained on my sleeve for weeks, and pointing a shaking forefinger at the dead wall ahead. "Neville's Court," said Mrs. Jablett, "is an alley, and you goes into it through an archway. It turns onto Fetter Lane on the right, and as you goes up, upper sight Bream's buildings." I thanked Mrs. Jablett and went on my way, glad that the morning round was nearly finished, and vaguely conscious of a growing appetite and of a desire to wash in hot water. The practice which I was conducting was not my own. It belonged to poor Dick Barnard, an old St. Margaret's man of irrepressible spirits and indifferent physique, who had started only the day before for a trip down the Mediterranean on board a tramp engaged in the current trade, and this, my second morning's round, was in some sort a voyage of geographical discovery. I walked on briskly up Fetter Lane until a narrow arched opening bearing the superscription Neville's Court arrested my steps, and here I turned to encounter one of those surprises that lie in wait for the traveler in London byways. Expecting to find the gray squalor of the ordinary London court, I looked out from under the shadow of the arch, past a row of decent little shops, through a vista full of light and color, a vista of ancient, warm-toned roofs and walls relieved by sunlit foliage. In the heart of London a tree is always a delightful surprise, but here was not only trees, but bushes and even flowers. The narrow footway was bordered by little gardens, which, with their wooden palings and well-kept shrubs, gave to the place an air of quaint and sober rusticity. And even as I entered, a bevy of work-girls with gaily colored blouses and hair aflame in the sunlight brightened up the quiet background like the wildflowers that spangle a summer hedgerow. In one of the gardens I noticed that the little paths were paved with what looked like circular tiles, but which, on inspection, I found to be old-fashioned stone ink bottles, buried bottom upwards. And I was meditating upon the quaint conceit of the forgotten scrivener who had thus adorned his habitation, a law writer perhaps, or an author, or perchance even a poet, when I perceived the number that I was seeking inscribed on a shabby door in a high wall. There was no bell or knocker, so lifting the latch I pushed the door open and entered. But if the court itself had been a surprise, this was a positive wonder, a dream. Here, within earshot of the rumble of Fleet Street, I was in an old-fashioned garden, enclosed by high walls, and now that the gate was shut, cut off from all sight and knowledge of the urban world that seethed without. I stood and gazed in delighted astonishment. Sun-gilded trees and flower-beds gay with blossom, lupins, snapdragons, nasturtiums, spiry foxgloves, and mighty hollyhocks formed the foreground, over which a pair of sulphur-tinted butterflies flitted, unmindful of a buxom and miraculously clean white cat which pursued them, dancing across the borders and clapping her snowy paws fruitlessly in mid-air. And the background was no less wonderful, a grand old house, dark-eaved and venerable, that must have looked down on this garden when ruffled dandies were borne in sedan chairs through the court, and gentle Isaac Walton, stealing forth from his shop in Fleet Street, strolled up Fetter Lane to go a-angling at Temple Mills. So overpowered was I by this unexpected vision that my hand was on the bottom knob of a row of bell-pulls before I recollected myself. And it was not until a most infernal jangling from within recalled me to my business that I observed underneath it a small brass plate inscribed Miss Oman. The door opened with some suddenness, and a short, middle-aged woman surveyed me hungrily. "Have I rung the wrong bell?" I asked, foolishly enough, I must admit. "How can I tell?" she demanded. "I expect you have. It's the sort of thing a man would do, ring the wrong bell and then say he's sorry." "I didn't go as far as that," I retorted. "It seems to have had the desired effect, and I've made your acquaintance into the bargain." "Whom do you want to see?" she asked. "Mr. Bellingham." "Are you the doctor?" "I'm a doctor." "Follow me upstairs," said Miss Oman, "and don't tread on the paint." I crossed the spacious hall and, preceded by my conductress, ascended a noble oak staircase, treading carefully on a ribbon of matting that ran up the middle. On the first floor landing Miss Oman opened a door and, pointing to the room, said, "Go in there and wait. I'll tell her you're here." "I said Mr. Bellingham," I began, but the door slammed on me, and Miss Oman's footsteps retreated rapidly down the stairs. It was at once obvious to me that I was in a very awkward position. The room into which I had been shown communicated with another, and though the door of communication was shut, I was unpleasantly aware of a conversation that was taking place in the adjoining room. At first, indeed, only a vague mutter, with a few disjointed phrases, came through the door, but suddenly an angry voice rang out, clear and painfully distinct. "Yes, I did, and I say it again. Bribery, collusion. That's what it amounts to. You want to square me." "Nothing of the kind, Godfrey," was the reply in a lower tone, but at this point I coughed emphatically and moved a chair, and the voices subsided once more into indistinct murmur. To distract my attention from my unseen neighbors, I glanced curiously about the room and speculated upon the personalities of its occupants. A very curious room it was, with its pathetic suggestion of decayed splendor and old-world dignity; a room full of interest and character, and of contrasts and perplexing contradictions. For the most part, it spoke of unmistakable though decent poverty. It was nearly bare of furniture, and what little there was of the cheapest: a small kitchen table and 3 Windsor chairs, 2 of them with arms, a threadbare string carpet on the floor, and a cheap cotton cloth on the table. These, with a set of bookshelves, frankly constructed of grocer's boxes, formed the entire suite. And yet, despite its poverty, the place exhaled an air of homely if rather ascetic comfort, and the taste was irreproachable. The quiet russet of the tablecloth struck a pleasant harmony with the subdued bluish green of the worn carpet. The Windsor chairs and the legs of the table had been carefully denuded of their glaring varnish and stained a sober brown, and the austerity of the whole was relieved by a ginger jar filled with fresh-cut flowers and set in the middle of the table. But the contrasts of which I have spoken were most singular and puzzling. There were the bookshelves, for instance, homemade and stained at the cost of a few pence, but filled with recent and costly new works on archaeology and ancient art. There were the objects on the mantelpiece, a facsimile in bronze, not bronze plaster, of the beautiful head of Hypnos, and a pair of fine Ushabti figures. There were the decorations of the walls, a number of etchings, signed proofs, every one of them, of Oriental subjects, and a splendid facsimile reproduction of an Egyptian papyrus. It was incongruous in the extreme, this mingling of costly refinements with the barest and shabbiest necessaries of life, of fastidious culture with manifest poverty. I could make nothing of it. What manner of man, I wondered, was this new patient of mine? Was he a miser, hiding himself and his wealth in this obscure court? An eccentric savant? A philosopher? Or, more probably, a crank? But at this point my meditations were interrupted by the voice from the adjoining room, once more raised in anger. "But I say that you are making an accusation. You are implying I made away with him." "Not at all," was the reply. "But I repeat, it is your business to ascertain what has become of him. The responsibility rests upon you." "Upon me?" rejoined the first voice. "And what about you? Your position is a pretty fishy one if it comes to that." "What?" roared the other. "Do you insinuate that I murdered my own brother?" During this amazing colloquy I stood gaping with sheer astonishment. Suddenly I recollected myself and, dropping into a chair, set my elbows on my knees and clapped my hands over my ears, and thus I must have remained for a full minute when I became aware of the closing of a door behind me. I sprang to my feet and turned in some embarrassment, for I must have looked unspeakably ridiculous, to confront the somber figure of a rather tall and strikingly handsome girl, who, as she stood with her hand on the knob of the door, saluted me with a formal bow. In an instantaneous glance I noted how perfectly